All right, so how many books are in that compendium you call a Bible? Do not do that again. Benjamin. 66 books. How many covenants are there in the Bible? Ooh, switched up the word. We call them testaments, but there are also some internal references in your Bible to them being an old covenant and a new covenant. So you have how many testaments is what we typically call them. There are 2. How many books are in the Old Testament? Talara? 39. How many books does that leave for the New Testament, Titus? 27. All right, there are 3 kinds of books in the Old Testament. Somebody name all 3. Right, prophetic, poetic, and historic, not necessarily in that order. All right, there are 3 types of books in the New Testament. Somebody name all 3. Lillian. Okay. Joshua. Go ahead. I'm waiting. I'll wait. You don't remember the question? Okay, there are 3 types of books in the New Testament. Name all 3. I know that this information is ingrained in that gray matter somewhere. All right, Benjamin. Okay, historic books, Pauline epistles, general epistles. Very good. All right. So enough of the structure of the Bible. We started talking about the eras that the Bible covers, and we said there are how many eras? Blair. Okay, these are in your notes, so you can even do that. All right, without looking at your notes, what's the name of the first era? Benjamin. Creation. What's the name of the second era? Patriarchs. Titus. What's the name of the third era? Exodus. Mr. Winger, what's the name of the fourth era? He's like, I have no idea. Lillian. What came right after Joshua, or what included in the book of Joshua. After the Exodus came the CC. No, not yet. We got one era before there. After the Judges, during the book of Joshua, was the era known as Conquest. The Conquest. It was a short era. And then came the Judges. Right. So how far did we get? Did we cover the Judges yet? Yes, we did. I remember covering Judges. Then after the Judges, how long was the era of the Judges? Talara. Roughly 400 years. Mr. Wingard has it up there. All right, how long was the conquest? Okay, no. Titus? No, it was roughly 1 generation. So we'll call it, how old, Joshua? Roughly 70 years, right. We didn't, that was kind of a trick question. I don't think I said that one. Let's see, the Exodus was how long? Roughly 400 years, right? The patriarchs, that was 3 generations. We didn't talk about that, but that's actually roughly about 400 years. Roughly. Because the Exodus era. No, because the Exodus era includes the time in Egypt. All right, so anyway, the Judges covers how long? What era comes after the Judges? The Kingdom era, which lasted about how long? Roughly 400 years, right. All right, so we talked about all of that. Let's see, and then we went into the next era, Lillian. Okay, that's part of the kingdom. That's also part of the kingdom. So the kingdom you had united and divided, and I heard an answer, captivity or the exile era. And that's actually brings us up to, I believe, where we are. So the exile era is the 7th era. The events of this era covers the 70 years that Israel and the leadership, especially of Israel, were out of the land. So the way this happened was during the divided kingdom era, the Assyrians came in and they conquered the land of Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And they took people captive and they planted some new people in, and that was all good. over east of Israel, the Babylonian Empire was ascendant. They came to power. They defeated the Assyrians. They inherited all of the land that the Assyrians owned. And then they kept going and they pushed into the land of Judah. And it was actually the Babylonians that carried the tribes of Judah and Benjamin captive. And so for about 70 years, there's a large community of Jews in Babylon. And the Babylonians put some other new people over in the land of Israel. And then after the Babylonian Empire, which lasted only about one generation in its ascent, the Persian Empire came up right behind them, defeated the Babylonian Empire, taking all of the land and people that the Babylonians had. And so you have all of this coming out. And the latter portion of that especially only lasted for about 70 years, and it covers that period. Now, the historical book that covers the time of the exile, there isn't one. There just isn't, because the children of Israel were in exile. So what little information we do have, biblically speaking, about this time comes to us from the prophetic book of Daniel. Daniel was a prophet of Israel. He was one of the people who was carried away captive by the Babylonians as a young man, probably Titus's age, about, no older than that probably. Taken captive by the Babylonians, may have been as young as Benjamin when he left the land of Israel, was educated by the Babylonians, was placed into the Babylonian government and actually succeeded very well, became a diplomat, actually represented Babylon to the Persian Empire, later became a functional person within the Persian Empire. Very cool dude, lived for a long time, had a stellar, interesting life. Lord willing, we're going to look at the book of Daniel next year, so I'm really excited about that prospect. So that's all that was going on. The place, the key place, if you had to guess without looking at your notes as you hear me talking, where does the key place sound like to you? Talara? Okay, Babylon and maybe Persia. Right, these are the two place names you hear me talking about. Babylon and Persia. There were Jews still living in the land of Israel. Common people were still there, many of them. There were people who were kind of part Jewish, which was a problem later on. But most of the Jewish leaders and what little real concrete information we have is Babylon and Persia. The key person during this time period is the person of Daniel, right? He's the one who told us what little we know. He's the one who really is he wrote the book of Daniel not to star in it, but he was the star anyway. You look at Daniel, what he wrote wasn't to say, here's the record of how great I am, but as you read what he wrote, you're like, wow, this dude was pretty amazing. And so he really was the key prophet during this time period. Now, following the exile, what do you think might happen after the people have been out of the land of Israel for a while? It was only going to last for 70 years. What naturally do you think happens then, Titus? They go back, right? And so we call this the era, the time of the return. Now, the return era covers the return of many Israelites from captivity. There was a Jewish community in Babylon, and more importantly, there was a Jewish community in Persia. And it was Zerubbabel and Nehemiah. They were able to lead groups of people from Persia back to Israel with the king of Persia's blessing and actually with his bankroll to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. And so the return covers all of these particular events. Now, there are two primary historical books that cover this era, and they are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Your last two Old Testament historical books, Ezra and Nehemiah, cover the return. Ezra came back first, and he actually rebuilt the city, started to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah came back a generation later, and it was he that actually rebuilt the walls and got temple worship back up and running the way it was supposed to be, served as a governor, and all kinds of good stuff. The secondary historical book that we get from this era is actually the story of Esther. Interestingly about this, the story of Esther does not happen in the land of Israel. Oh. Where does it happen, Titus? No, close. Clara. No, not Sumeria. Mrs. Pettit. Persia. The book of Esther actually takes place in the country of Persia. Esther, who is a Jewess, a female Jew, it's called the Jewess, who actually ends up getting married to the king of Persia. Pretty cool deal. And so it tells, you get a really good kind of glimpse of the Jewish community that exists there in Persia, because it's not just in the capital city, but it's really throughout much of the country. That Jewish community that was in Persia was alive and active into the New Testament time. The Apostle Peter, after Jesus' death, eventually went to the area of Persia, and actually that's where he ministered out of. Was that area, the Jewish community that was there. That was kind of his base of operation. So it was very vibrant, very active community they had there. Now, the place of the return era, though the people returned to the land, the story of the return, where do you think that might focus? You could say Israel, and you would not be wholly wrong for saying that. The people returned to the land of Israel. But Ezra and Nehemiah, your two primary historical books, Ezra came back, and what did he do? He rebuilt the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Nehemiah came back, and what did he do? He rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. And so the story during the return, though you could say Israel, it really focuses down to the city of Jerusalem, becomes really the key place during this time period. The next one's kind of a hard question. Who is the key person of this era? I think you could argue probably two people, Ezra or Nehemiah, right. These are the guys who led the charge. I kind of focus around Ezra, though I like Nehemiah. He's a very cool guy. But Ezra was the guy who led that first wave back to the city of Jerusalem, who really got things started. And so he becomes a very key person, though Nehemiah might have had a greater influence, because Nehemiah got the walls up. Nehemiah kind of solidified and recodified and got temple worship back up and running, all those kinds of things. But it was really Ezra that got stuff going in the right direction. How long did this return era last, Talara? Roughly 400 years. It's crazy the way this number keeps popping up. And again, roughly. Don't get too exact on it. The next era is kind of a weird one, because we have, I said we just got to Ezra and Nehemiah, the last two books of your history. Contemporary with Nehemiah was a guy named Malachi. He was a good Italian Jew, Malachi, also known as Malachi, who actually prophesied a little bit later, probably than Nehemiah, but around the same time. And what do you know about the book of Malachi? Clara? Huh? Mr. Wingert? It's the last book of the Old Testament, right? It is the end of the Old Testament. So you have the last historical book and the last prophetical book, and you get the end of the Old Testament, but history keeps marching on. And so we've really come to the end of the Old Testament. This next era is kind of technically Old Testament, but that's a technicality. We're going to call this era, I call it the silence era. You could also call it, and people do call it, the intertestamental period, but that's a lot of consonants. And so let's just stick with the silence era. It's like Radio God goes off the air. Literally, that's kind of what happens. There's no more history being written. There's no more prophecy being written. It's just like God stops talking for how long? About 400 years. It's crazy the way this number keeps popping up. Yeah, I don't know, but it's about how long it was. And so the silence era covers, or really doesn't cover, as the case may be, the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that's why some people will call it the intertestamental period. It's the period between the two testaments. What history books do you suppose cover the era of silence? By definition, none, because that's the point. What is the key place during this era of silence? There is a key place, Talara. There is, yeah, Jerusalem, very good. Jerusalem is very key during this time period. There are a lot of things going on. Even though God isn't talking, writing Bible, there are still a lot of things going on, and a lot of it focuses in the city of Jerusalem. The key person during this time period, there isn't really a key person. There is a key group of people. Really, there are two contenders that you could reach for. The first one, who I think is a key person, is a group of people, really a family of people called the Maccabees. The Maccabees, you don't need to write it down, but just think about it. So you have the Assyrian Empire, then you have the Babylonian Empire, then you have which empire? The Assyria, Babylon, Persian Empire. And during this silence era, the Persian Empire rules the world during the silence era. Well, the Persian Empire eventually fell to a group of people called the Greek Empire. And so the Greek Empire rose, and they gave us the Olympics, and they really provided a language throughout much of the civilized world. And then, like all the empires before it, the Greek Empire collapsed, and another empire came up, and who was that? The Roman Empire. And they gave us roads, and they gave us business, and they gave us laws, and they gave us money, and a whole other language, and a group of gods that looked a lot, strangely enough, like the Greek gods, but had different names. And so you have all of this going on during this silent period. You have the Persian Empire falling, Greek Empire rise, Greek Empire fall, the Roman Empire rising. The Maccabees were a group of Jews. They were a family of Jews primarily, who really disliked the Romans, to the place of they would just randomly terrorize and attack. The Romans would have called the Maccabees terrorists, and the Jews would have called the Maccabees patriots, and it's all a matter of perspective, I guess. And they were a very important and very influential group of people. There's actually two books called the Maccabees, not in our Bible, but they are very old books that document some of the events of this family. But the more important group that comes out of this time period, and it's important to note the history that's moving around the rest of the world, but the very important group that emerges during this time period is a group called the Pharisees. We know that name, right? You guys know the Pharisees? You know the Pharisees? Really? I've never met one. How did you know them? So you have the Pharisees. They are a religious group that rises to a position of considerable influence among the Jewish people. And so again, the story focuses on Jerusalem. You have the Pharisees come up as this very influential. They're a religious group, and yet they are a political group as well. Very, very prominent group of people that factor into a lot of things that happen during this time period and really happen into the next time period. And we are already over time, so I'm going to stop there.